At 30,000 feet, the pilot suddenly collapsed. The co-pilot's desperate voice came through the speakers asking if anyone could fly. A quiet man in the back stood up and walked forward. When he revealed his military call sign to the cockpit, everyone was shocked. Nobody expected this. Before you hear the full story, please comment below which country you are watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when 287 people all stop breathing at the same time. Because passengers on Flight 617 from Los Angeles to New York did not expect their pilot to collapse halfway across the country. And they certainly did not expect to be asked if any of them could help fly a commercial airliner at 30,000 feet above the ground. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire cabin was frozen in shock as their brains tried to process what they had just heard. Then all hell broke loose. A woman in row 8 started screaming. Her scream triggered others. Soon there were a dozen people crying out in fear. A businessman in first class stood up and started yelling at the flight attendants, demanding answers, demanding to know how this could happen, demanding someone do something. His face was red with anger that was really just terror wearing a different mask. In the back of the plane, a young mother clutched her 2 small children and started sobbing uncontrollably. Her kids started crying too, not understanding what was happening but knowing from their mother's fear that something was very wrong. Other passengers tried to comfort them but their own voices were shaking too badly to be reassuring. Phones came out everywhere despite the rules about airplane mode. People were calling family members, leaving voicemail messages that sounded like final goodbyes. I love you. I am sorry for all the fights we had. Please take care of the kids. Tell Mom I was thinking of her. The messages of people who believed they were about to die. The cabin had been peaceful just 5 minutes ago. People were reading books, watching movies on their seat screens, sleeping with neck pillows, eating snacks from the beverage service. Normal Tuesday afternoon flight sounds filled the air. The hum of engines, quiet conversations, a baby crying somewhere in the back, the rolling sound of the beverage cart moving down the aisle. Now everything was frozen. Eyes were wide with fear. Hands gripped armrests. Someone started crying. Someone else was whispering prayers. The reality crashed down on everyone at once. They were trapped in a metal tube 7 miles above the earth, and the person flying it just collapsed. In seat 14A, a man in his early 40s with short gray hair and a weathered face slowly removed his reading glasses. He had been sitting quietly for the entire flight, reading a paperback book about World War II history. He wore simple clothes. Blue jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, running shoes. Nothing about him stood out. He looked like 1,000 other middle-aged men on 1,000 other flights. Someone you would never notice. Someone you would forget the moment you walked off the plane. His name was David Sullivan. But that was not the name that mattered. What mattered was the name very few people knew. The name that was never written on passenger lists or driver's licenses or credit cards. The name that only appeared in classified military records and secure communications between people who operated in places the public never heard about. David had been a fighter pilot for the United States Navy for 22 years. He had flown F/A-18 Super Hornets off aircraft carriers in combat zones around the world. He had logged over 4,000 flight hours in military aircraft, including 200 combat missions in hostile airspace where one mistake meant death. He had trained countless younger pilots in advanced tactics and emergency procedures. He had been shot at, had dealt with engine failures at sea, had landed on pitching carrier decks in storms that would terrify normal people. The call sign Ghost came from his ability to appear and disappear in combat situations. To strike targets and vanish before enemy forces could respond. To fly missions so precisely that his squadron mates said he moved like a ghost through the sky. Silent, deadly, impossible to track. The stories about Ghost were legendary in Navy aviation circles. There was the mission over hostile territory where he had saved an entire strike package by taking out enemy radar sites that nobody else could find. The night carrier landing in zero visibility conditions that other pilots said was impossible but Ghost made look routine. The time his aircraft took damage from ground fire, but he still completed the mission and brought his wounded plane back to the carrier deck with perfect precision. He had received medals that sat in a box in his closet because he never talked about them. Commendations from admirals who called him one of the finest pilots they had ever seen. Letters from pilots whose lives he had saved through his skill and quick thinking. But to his neighbors and co-workers in his current civilian job, he was just a quiet middle-aged guy who worked in defense consulting and never mentioned his military background unless someone specifically asked. He had retired from active duty 3 years ago. Now he worked as a consultant for defense contractors, which meant he spent most of his time in meetings and writing reports instead of flying. He missed the cockpit every single day. Missed the feeling of controlling a powerful machine through three-dimensional space. Missed the absolute focus required when your life depends on making the right decision in half a second. He was flying commercial today because his consulting work had taken him to Los Angeles for a week of boring meetings. He had chosen this afternoon flight because it was direct and would get him home to his family in New York by dinner time. He had been looking forward to a quiet flight where nobody bothered him and he could finish his book and maybe take a nap. David looked around the cabin. He could see the panic spreading like wildfire. People were crying now. Others were making phone calls even though they had been told to keep phones in airplane mode. Leaving goodbye messages for loved ones because they thought they were going to die. The fear was becoming dangerous. Panic could cause a stampede. People could get hurt even before the plane had any actual problems. The flight attendants were trying to maintain order, but their faces showed they were terrified too. They were trained for medical emergencies and evacuations and dealing with difficult passengers. They were not trained for what to do when the pilot collapses and there is nobody qualified to fly the plane. David unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. His movement was calm and deliberate. The businessman next to him in 14B looked at him with confusion and fear, clearly wondering what this random passenger was doing standing up during an emergency. David stepped into the aisle and started walking toward the front of the plane. His stride was steady and purposeful. He had walked toward danger 1,000 times before. This was no different. Someone needed help. He had the skills to provide that help. Everything else was just details to be worked out. A flight attendant saw him approaching and immediately moved to intercept him. Her name tag said Jennifer. She was young, probably mid-20s, and her hands were shaking as she raised them to stop him. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately," Jennifer said, her voice trying to sound authoritative but cracking with stress. "We are dealing with an emergency situation and all passengers must remain seated until we have further instructions from the cockpit." "I heard the announcement," David said quietly, his voice calm and steady in a way that made Jennifer pause. The first officer asked if anyone has aviation experience. "I need to speak with her right now because I can help with this situation." Jennifer looked at him with the same disbelief that anyone would have when a random passenger claims they can help fly a commercial airliner. "Sir, I appreciate that you want to help, but this is a very serious emergency that requires professional pilots. I really need you to return to your seat before I have to call for assistance." "My name is David Sullivan," he said, pulling out his wallet and showing her his military ID that he still carried even though he was retired. "I am a former Navy fighter pilot with over 4,000 flight hours in military aircraft. I have extensive experience with emergency procedures and I can assist your first officer with whatever she needs. Every second we spend having this conversation is a second we are not helping the person in the cockpit who is flying this plane alone and probably scared out of her mind right now." Jennifer stared at the military ID. She could see the words United States Navy and the photo that matched the man in front of her. Her training had not prepared her for this specific scenario, but her instincts told her that this man was different from someone just trying to be helpful without having actual skills. "Wait here," she said, making a decision that went against standard procedures but matched what her gut was telling her. She moved quickly to the cockpit door and used the intercom to speak with the first officer. David could not hear what she was saying, but he could see her gesturing back toward him while she talked. 30 seconds later, the reinforced cockpit door opened. First Officer Rachel Chen appeared in the doorway. She was in her late 30s, Asian American, with short black hair pulled back tightly. Her face was pale with stress and her eyes showed the kind of fear that comes from being completely overwhelmed by a situation that is spiraling out of control. "Jennifer says you are a military pilot," Chen said, her voice tight with tension. "I need to verify that before I let anyone into this cockpit." "What is your experience?" "Former Navy fighter pilot," David replied immediately. F/A-18 Super Hornets. 22 years of service. 4,000 flight hours. 200 combat missions. Retired 3 years ago. I am not current on commercial aircraft procedures, but I understand flight systems, emergency protocols, and how to assist a pilot in command during crisis situations. Chen studied his face for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. She was making a calculation that could save everyone on this plane or could make everything worse. But she was alone in that cockpit with an unconscious captain and 287 people depending on her to make the right choice. "Get in here," Chen said, opening the door fully and stepping aside. "Captain Morrison had what looks like a massive heart attack about 8 minutes ago. He is unconscious and not responding. I have got the aircraft on autopilot, but I am completely overloaded trying to fly and coordinate with air traffic control and figure out where we can make an emergency landing. I need help and I need it now." David stepped into the cockpit and his training kicked in immediately. Years of combat experience had taught him to assess crisis situations in seconds. To see what mattered and ignore what did not. To prioritize problems and solve them in the right order. The scene was worse than he expected. Captain Morrison was not just unconscious. His skin had a gray color that David recognized from combat situations. This man was dying. Maybe already dead. His breathing was barely visible. His body was completely limp. If they did not get him to a hospital in the next 30 minutes, he probably would not survive. First Officer Chen looked like she was barely holding it together. Her hands were shaking. Sweat was running down her face. Her eyes were too wide, showing white all around. She was operating on pure adrenaline and willpower, but she was close to breaking. David had seen that look before on young pilots facing their first real combat emergency. The look of someone who knows they are in over their head but is too professional to quit. David stepped into the cockpit and immediately processed what he saw with the trained eye of someone who had spent 2 decades reading complex flight situations in seconds. Captain Morrison was slumped in his seat, unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. The instrument panel showed the aircraft was stable in level flight with autopilot engaged. Airspeed, altitude, heading all normal. But David knew that autopilot could only do so much. It could not handle the complex decisions required for emergency situations. First Officer Chen looked exhausted and overwhelmed. She was clearly competent enough to be flying this aircraft, but she was trying to do the job of 2 pilots while dealing with the psychological shock of watching her captain collapse without warning. "What do you need me to do?" David asked, his voice cutting through the chaos with the clarity that comes from combat experience where clear communication saves lives. "I need to get Captain Morrison out of his seat so I can secure him and make sure he is not going to interfere with the controls," Chen said, speaking rapidly as stress compressed her words into urgent bursts. "Then I need to coordinate with air traffic control about emergency landing options. We are currently over Kansas and I need to find the nearest suitable airport with emergency medical facilities. I need to calculate fuel and descent profiles and brief the cabin crew about emergency procedures. And I need to do all of this while keeping this plane in the air because autopilot is not going to land this thing for me." "Understood," David said, already moving toward Captain Morrison's position. "Let me help you move the captain. Then I will take the right seat and assist with communications and procedures while you focus on flying and making command decisions." Together they carefully moved Captain Morrison out of his seat. It was difficult work in the confined cockpit space, but David had done emergency medical evacuations before in much worse conditions. They secured Morrison in a position where he could not accidentally contact any flight controls. David could see the captain's condition was critical. He needed intensive medical care immediately, but that was impossible at 30,000 feet. David slid into the right seat, the co-pilot's seat, and felt something shift inside him. It had been 3 years since he sat in a pilot's seat with actual flight controls in front of him. The instrument panel was different from military aircraft he had flown. More screens, different layout, commercial systems instead of tactical displays. But the fundamentals were the same. Airspeed, altitude, heading, navigation, engine parameters. The language of flying was universal once you learned it. First Officer Chen dropped back into the left seat and immediately grabbed the radio microphone. Her hand was shaking as she keyed the transmission. Kansas City Center, United 617, we have an emergency. Captain has suffered apparent heart attack and is unconscious. First Officer is at controls with assistance from a qualified passenger. We need immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport with full emergency response capabilities. We need to start our descent as soon as possible. The reply came back within seconds. The air traffic controller's voice was professionally calm but with an undertone that showed he understood the gravity of their situation. United 617, Kansas City Center copies your emergency. Understand you have pilot incapacitation. Stand by for coordination. Your current position shows you approximately 90 miles north of Wichita. Wichita Eisenhower has 2 long runways and full emergency facilities. Can you maintain present altitude and heading while we coordinate? Affirmative, maintaining flight level 310, Chen replied, using the professional terminology that meant 31,000 feet. We can hold present position but would prefer to begin descent as soon as practical. Our crew situation is not stable and we want to minimize time at altitude. David was already pulling up navigation displays and weather information. His fingers moved across the screens with the muscle memory of someone who had done this thousands of times, even though the specific system was different from what he had trained on. The basics were the same. Find the airport. Check weather. Plan the approach. Wichita weather shows winds light and variable, visibility 10 miles, clear skies, David said, reading from the displays. 2 runways available, both over 10,000 feet with ILS approaches. Recommend we request runway 1 right because it has better emergency vehicle access and will keep us away from other traffic. Chen glanced at him with surprise. You know commercial approach procedures. The fundamentals are the same as military, David said. The aircraft might be different but physics does not change. I can assist with navigation and systems monitoring while you handle the actual flying. You are pilot in command here. I am just an extra set of hands and eyes. The radio crackled again. United 617, you are cleared to descend and maintain flight level 240. Proceed direct to Wichita. Expect vectors for ILS approach runway 1 right. Emergency equipment is being positioned. Medical facilities are being notified for immediate ambulance response. How many souls on board and fuel remaining? Chen keyed the microphone. United 617 descending to flight level 240, direct Wichita. We have 287 souls on board including crew. Fuel remaining is approximately 18,000 pounds. We will need immediate medical transport for our incapacitated crew member upon landing. David was already working through the descent checklist from memory, calling out items that needed to be verified before they started down. Descent checklist. Pressurization set for descent. Passenger signs on. Cabin crew notified. Altimeters checked and set. Landing data computed. Chen looked at him again, and this time her expression showed something beyond surprise. It showed recognition that this passenger was not just someone who knew a little about flying. He was someone who understood procedures at a professional level. She began the descent, reducing power and allowing the aircraft to start down smoothly through the thin air at high altitude. David monitored the instruments, calling out any deviations from normal parameters, watching for problems that might develop during the descent. Behind them in the main cabin, the passengers were experiencing their own crisis. The announcement about pilot incapacitation had created exactly the kind of panic that airlines train their crews to prevent. Some people were praying. Others were crying. Many were on their phones leaving goodbye messages because they thought this was the end. The businessman from seat 14B was telling other passengers that the man who had been sitting next to him had gone to the cockpit. This information spread through the cabin like wildfire, creating new waves of confusion. Who was that passenger? Why was he in the cockpit? How could a random traveler help with a professional pilot emergency? In the cockpit, David and Chen were working through the descent procedures with increasing coordination. Chen was starting to trust that David actually knew what he was doing. She was delegating tasks to him that would normally require a qualified crew member. He was handling radio communications while she flew. He was monitoring instruments while she calculated approach speeds. He was pulling up procedures and checklists while she made decisions about configuration and descent rates. They fell into a rhythm that military pilots would recognize immediately. Crew resource management. Dividing the workload according to capability. Supporting each other through clear communication. Working toward the shared goal of getting everyone on the ground safely. United 617, descend and maintain 12,000 feet. Reduce speed to 250 knots. Turn left heading 180 for downwind to runway 1 right, the controller's voice came through clearly. Descending to 12,000, reducing to 250 knots, turning left to 180, David replied, handling the radio communication while Chen focused on executing the instructions with precise control inputs. The descent continued through multiple altitude assignments as Kansas City Center guided them lower and positioned them for the approach. Other traffic was being held or redirected to create a protected corridor for United 617. Emergency vehicles on the ground were taking positions along the runway. At 10,000 feet, Chen began configuring the aircraft for landing. Extending flaps in stages. Lowering the landing gear. Managing the changes in drag and handling that came with these extensions. David called out each step of the landing checklist, verifying that systems were responding normally. United 617, you are cleared for ILS approach runway 1 right. Contact Wichita Tower on 118.7, Kansas City Center said, handing them off to the final controller who would clear them to land. Tower, United 617 is with you on the ILS 1 right, David transmitted. We have the field in sight and request priority landing clearance for our emergency. United 617, Wichita Tower, you are cleared to land runway 1 right. Winds calm. Emergency equipment standing by. You have the airport to yourself. No other traffic is a factor. Chen Han flew the final approach with concentration that blocked out everything except the immediate task of bringing 287 people safely to the ground. The aircraft responded smoothly to her control inputs. David monitored instruments and called out altitudes and airspeeds, providing the backup that helped ensure they maintained the exact flight path. 1,000 feet, David called out calmly. On glide slope. On course. Airspeed 140. Looking good. 500 feet, he continued. Runway in sight. Sync rate normal. Chen's hands were steady on the controls now. All the fear and stress had been pushed aside by the intense focus required for landing. This was the moment where everything either worked or it did not. Where months and years of training either paid off or failed. 200 feet. 100 feet. 50 feet. The runway appeared ahead. Emergency vehicles lined both sides with lights flashing red and white and amber. It looked like a corridor of light guiding them home. Fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, all waiting to respond if something went wrong in these final critical seconds. 30 feet. 20. 10. The main landing gear touched down smoothly. Chen had executed a textbook landing that would have earned praise in normal circumstances and was even more impressive given the stress of the past 40 minutes. She deployed thrust reversers and applied brakes with careful control, bringing the big aircraft to a stop on the runway. The passengers erupted in applause and cheers and crying. People were hugging strangers, thanking God, calling family members to say they were alive. The relief was so powerful it was almost physical, like a wave washing over everyone in the cabin. United 617 is down and stopped on runway 1 right, David transmitted. We need immediate medical transport for our captain. Copy, United 617. Medical units are approaching now. Outstanding work bringing that aircraft in safely. Chen finally released the controls and sat back, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger was over. She looked at David with an expression that mixed gratitude and disbelief. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. "I mean, you said Navy fighter pilot, but that does not explain how you knew exactly what to do like you have been flying commercial aircraft your whole career." "The principles are the same," David said simply. "Different aircraft, same physics. Different procedures, same basic emergency protocols. I have been flying for 22 years in situations where mistakes were not an option. This was just another emergency that needed to be handled calmly and professionally." The cockpit door opened and paramedics rushed in, immediately beginning treatment on Captain Morrison and preparing to transport him to the waiting ambulance. Other emergency personnel boarded to assist with passenger evacuation and check for any other medical issues. Airport officials and FAA investigators arrived within minutes, beginning the documentation process that follows every aviation emergency. When they learned that a passenger had been in the cockpit assisting the first officer, they were immediately skeptical because regulations do not permit unauthorized personnel in the cockpit during flight operations. But when they checked David Sullivan's identification and ran his background verification, their attitude changed completely. Former Navy fighter pilot. Thousands of flight hours. Combat experience. The kind of credentials that commanded respect throughout the aviation community. First Officer Rachel Chen gave detailed statements to investigators about exactly how David had assisted during the emergency. How he had handled communications and checklists and systems monitoring with professional competence. How he had freed her to focus on flying. How without his help, she would have been dangerously overloaded trying to manage all the simultaneous demands of the emergency alone. The story exploded across news media within hours. The combination of dramatic emergency landing and military hero helping save a commercial flight created exactly the narrative that captures public attention. Video from news helicopters showed the smooth landing. Interviews with passengers revealed their shock and gratitude. Within 3 hours, the story was trending on every social media platform. Hashtag Flight 617 and hashtag GhostPilot became viral hashtags. The video of the landing had been viewed 10 million times. News networks were running special reports with aviation experts analyzing what had happened and how rare it was for a situation like this to have such a positive outcome. The passengers gave emotional interviews that were played over and over on television. They described the absolute terror they felt when they heard the announcement about the pilot collapse. The certainty that they were going to die. The disbelief when they learned a quiet passenger had saved them all. One elderly woman said she had been praying for a miracle and God had answered by putting a fighter pilot in seat 14A. A young father said he had been writing a goodbye message to his wife when the plane landed safely and now he would never take a single day with his family for granted again. A business executive said he had sat next to David Sullivan for 2 hours and never imagined the ordinary-looking man was actually an extraordinary hero. The businessman from 14B gave emotional interviews about sitting next to David for 2 hours, never knowing that the quiet man reading a book was actually a highly trained fighter pilot with the skills to save their lives when crisis struck. He said he felt ashamed that he had barely noticed David during the flight, had dismissed him as just another random passenger, never guessing that this unremarkable seeming man possessed remarkable abilities. Passengers who had been certain they were going to die expressed overwhelming gratitude that their flight had happened to include someone with David's background and willingness to help. Aviation experts initially questioned whether a military fighter pilot could meaningfully assist with flying a commercial airliner, suggesting the aircraft types were too different. But other pilots, especially those with both military and commercial experience, confirmed that David's skills were absolutely transferable and that his assistance had been crucial to the successful outcome. The military aviation community responded with pride. David Sullivan's call sign Ghost was mentioned in news reports, and his former squadron mates posted tributes online about his skill and character. Stories emerged about his combat missions and his reputation as one of the finest pilots of his generation. David himself refused most interview requests. He gave one brief statement to the press: "I was a passenger who happened to have relevant skills when help was needed. First Officer Chen is the real hero here. She flew that aircraft and made all the critical decisions. I just assisted with procedures. Any qualified pilot would have done the same." But the public disagreed. They saw David as exactly the kind of hero people want to believe exists. Someone with extraordinary skills who stays humble. Someone who steps up in crisis without seeking attention. Someone who makes the impossible look routine because of years of dedication and training. Rachel Chen recovered from the trauma of the emergency and continued her career as a commercial pilot. She credited David with saving not just the passengers but also her career, because without his help she might have made mistakes that could have ended in disaster. Captain Morrison survived his heart attack and recovered enough to eventually retire with full honors. He never returned to flying, but he sent David a personal letter thanking him for helping save his life and the lives of everyone aboard Flight 617. David returned to his quiet life as a defense consultant. He went back to his family in New York and his boring meetings and his reports and presentations. But he carried with him the knowledge that his skills had mattered one more time. That the decades of training and practice and discipline had paid off in the most unexpected way possible. His wife Sarah had been waiting at the airport when the flight finally arrived in New York 6 hours late. She had seen the news coverage and knew what had happened before David could explain. She hugged him tight and said she had always known he was a hero, but now the whole world knew it too. Their teenage daughter Emma cried when she saw him and said she had been so scared watching the news reports about the emergency landing, terrified that something might go wrong at the last second. David tried to return to normal life, but normal life had changed. People recognized him on the street. Strangers came up to thank him. A father whose wife had been on Flight 617 found David's office and showed up just to shake his hand and say thank you for bringing his wife home safely. Children at his daughter's school asked for his autograph because their parents had told them he was a real hero. The Navy reached out to ask if he would be willing to speak at the Naval Academy about his experience. To tell young pilots that their training matters not just in combat but potentially in any emergency situation they might encounter in civilian life. To emphasize that skills and discipline and the ability to stay calm under pressure are gifts that keep giving throughout your entire life, not just during active duty. Airlines began changing their protocols based on what happened on Flight 617. They developed better procedures for identifying passengers with aviation experience who could assist in emergencies. They created training programs for flight attendants on how to rapidly verify credentials and make quick decisions about bringing qualified passengers forward during crisis situations. The call sign Ghost had earned its reputation through combat missions that would remain classified forever. But now it also represented something else. The idea that heroes walk among us unnoticed until the moment they are desperately needed. That preparation and skill and calm under pressure can mean the difference between tragedy and triumph. That the quiet person sitting next to you might be someone extraordinary hiding in plain sight. David thought about that afternoon flight often in the weeks and months that followed. About how close 287 people had come to disaster. About how a random series of events had put him in exactly the right place at exactly the right time with exactly the right skills to make a difference. About how all those years of training that sometimes seemed excessive or unnecessary had suddenly become the most important knowledge he possessed. He thought about the young fighter pilots he had trained during his Navy career and wondered if any of them would someday face a similar situation. If the lessons he had taught them about staying calm and following procedures and never giving up would save lives in ways neither he nor they could predict. He hoped they would carry forward the same dedication to excellence that had defined his career and had ultimately saved Flight 617. On Flight 617, at 30,000 feet, when the pilot collapsed and panic threatened to overwhelm everyone aboard, a quiet passenger with a legendary call sign stepped forward and reminded the world what true professionalism looks like. And 287 people went home to their families because of it. Because Ghost was there when they needed him most.